The 7-foot man didn't knock. He kicked the door clean off its hinges, stepped over the bodyguard bleeding out on the floor, and locked eyes on the most feared crime lord in Harbor City. Like the rest of the room simply didn't exist. People were screaming, chairs flipped, glass exploded, and somewhere in the middle of that restaurant turning itself inside out, a 22-year-old waitress stood frozen behind the counter with a tray of soup she hadn't set down yet. Nobody noticed her. That was about to save one man's life and destroy hers. If that had been you, exhausted, underpaid, just trying to get through another shift, what would you have done? If this kind of story grabs you, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The soup was tomato basil. How special. Table 7 had been waiting 11 minutes, and Lena Mercer knew because she'd checked the clock above the bar 3 times since she picked up the order. 11 minutes wasn't bad for a Friday. On a Friday at Caruso's, 11 minutes was practically a miracle. She was 22 years old and had been working doubles at this restaurant for 9 months. Before that, it was a diner near the waterfront that smelled like fryer oil and broken dreams. Before that, a coffee chain where her manager once docked her pay for being 2 minutes late after a bus breakdown. She had learned early, not in any classroom, but in the specific exhausted way that life teaches you, that the world didn't care about your reasons. It only counted what you showed up with. Tonight she'd shown up with a soup tray, a cracked phone screen in her apron pocket, and a water bill that was now officially 12 days overdue. The restaurant was packed. It usually was on Fridays. Caruso's had a reputation for decent pasta, cheap wine that the menu made sound expensive, and a location on the corner of 5th and Merchant that put it right in the middle of Harbor City's version of upscale. White tablecloths. Dim lighting. The kind of soft jazz piped through speakers that nobody actually listened to but somehow made the food taste $1 more expensive. Lena had stopped noticing any of it months ago. She threaded between tables without thinking, her body running on a kind of autopilot that only comes from doing the same motion 1,000 times. Excuse me. Watch your elbow. Coming through. She had blisters on both heels that she'd stopped registering. Her lower back had developed a dull, permanent ache that she told herself she'd get checked out someday, fully aware that someday required money she didn't have. She was halfway across the dining room when the door opened. Not the front door. The side door. The one staff used to take smoke breaks, the one that was supposed to be locked from the outside. The man who walked through it was enormous. She noticed him the way you notice something that your brain takes a half-second longer to process, because the size of him simply didn't fit into a normal mental category. He was north of 6.5 feet, maybe close to 7, broad in the way that suggests bone rather than bulk. He wore no jacket, just a long-sleeved black shirt, dark pants, and steel-toed boots that left actual sound on the floor with each step. In his right hand, held loosely at his side like it weighed nothing, was a length of rusted steel pipe. Nobody moved. Not the maitre d', not the sommelier, not the couple at the nearest table who'd been mid-argument about something and now sat with their mouths still open, all argument forgotten. Then one of the men near the back booth stood up. Lena hadn't paid much attention to that booth. She'd taken a drink order there earlier in the evening. Water with lemon, no ice, for a man who'd said it quietly and without looking at her. She'd registered the small army of men stationed around the booth, the way you register scaffolding on a building. Present. Functional. Background. Now the first one of those men stood up, reached under his jacket, and was shot before he completed the motion. The sound was different than anything Lena had heard in her life. Not the sharp bang from movies, duller, more physical, more permanent. The man dropped sideways into a table and took the tablecloth and a half-full bottle of Chianti with him. Someone screamed. Then everyone was screaming. Lena's tray tilted. The soup bowl slid an inch. She grabbed it with her free hand without thinking, which later she would find almost funny. That her first instinct in the middle of a massacre was to not spill someone's order. The giant didn't rush. That was the detail that would stay with her for weeks after. He didn't run, didn't duck, didn't flinch when a second bodyguard opened fire from near the kitchen entrance. He turned slightly, took the shot in his left arm like it was an inconvenience, and walked forward. Raised the pipe. Brought it down once. The second bodyguard did not get up. The room was fully chaos now. People running for the front exit, knocking over chairs, screaming in 3 languages. A woman near the window had her face in her hands. A busboy Lena had worked beside for 4 months bolted past her without making eye contact, which somehow felt like the most human thing she'd witnessed yet. She should have run. She understood this clearly and completely. Her legs simply weren't cooperating. The man in the booth had still not moved. He sat with both hands visible on the table, a glass of water untouched in front of him, and he was watching the giant approach with an expression Lena could only describe as tired. Not afraid, not calculating, just tired. When you've had the same argument so many times that you've stopped being surprised it's happening again. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, dark hair, silver at the temples. A suit that had probably cost more than Lena's last 3 rent payments. His jaw was set. His eyes were steady. And when a third bodyguard was knocked unconscious against the far wall, and the giant was now close enough that the distance between them was measured in seconds rather than feet, the man simply exhaled. "Moretti says hello," the giant said. His voice matched the rest of him, low, grinding, the kind of voice that seemed to come from somewhere below the chest. The man in the booth said nothing. "He said you'd have something clever. He told me not to listen." Still nothing. The giant raised the pipe, and Lena Mercer, standing 12 feet away with a tray of cooling soup, slipped on a wet floor that a busboy hadn't had time to put a sign over. Her right foot went out sideways. She lurched. The tray swung wide, and the instinct to correct her balance threw her weight in the exact wrong direction. She grabbed the nearest stable object, which happened to be the handle of a large service cart. The cart was loaded. On top of it sat a 30-liter steel urn of boiling water that had been heating for the kitchen's pasta station, used for refilling the pots during service. The cart rolled. The urn tipped. She was already falling when it happened, so she only saw the arc of it from below then. Steam and scalding water catching the light as it came down in a wide sheet directly into the path of the giant, who had been mid-swing and had nowhere to go. The scream that came out of him was the loudest sound in the room. The water hit his face and chest and arms, and for 1 full second he was nothing but sound and motion, hands flying up to cover his eyes, the pipe clattering to the floor. The urn itself, heavy steel, 30 liters of water, the weight of it was something close to 60 pounds, caught him across the knee on the way down with a sound like a bat hitting a piece of wet wood. He lost his footing. A man that size falling is not like a normal person falling. It's structural. It happens in stages. His knee buckled, and his upper body continued forward, and the marble service counter, the one Caruso himself had imported from somewhere and loved to mention to guests, caught the side of his skull with the specific finality of stone meeting bone. Silence. Not immediate silence. The kind that fills in from the edges, replacing the chaos piece by piece until you realize the loudest thing left in the room is the jazz still playing from the speakers. Something slow. Something with a piano. The giant was on the floor, and he was not moving, and he was never going to move again. 3 seconds had passed since the urn tipped. Possibly less. Lena was on her hands and knees on the restaurant floor, her palm already blistering where she'd caught hot water, staring at the man on the ground. The soup bowl had survived. It sat upright on the floor beside her, barely spilled, steam still rising gently from the surface. She became aware slowly of someone standing over her. Not the man from the booth. He hadn't moved yet. This was one of his remaining men, alive and operational, with a gun he'd drawn and not fired, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then a hand appeared in her field of vision, an offered hand. Not the bodyguard's. She looked up. The man from the booth stood in front of her. Up close, the tiredness she'd noticed from across the room was even more visible. In the lines around his eyes, in the particular way his shoulders held tension that never fully left. He was looking at her not with the cold assessment she'd expected, but with something more complicated. Something that resembled, almost uncomfortably, recognition. Like he'd seen someone like her before and knew exactly what she was about to go through. She didn't take his hand. She pushed herself upright on her own. Not out of pride exactly, more out of reflex, the same way you wave off help at a grocery store when you've dropped something. She was already in the habit of handling things herself. He let his hand drop without comment. Around them, the restaurant was slowly, haltingly, reassembling itself. Someone had stopped the music. Someone else had opened the front doors, and the night air moved through the space for the first time. 3 of his men had reappeared, moving through the room with efficiency, making phone calls in low voices, redirecting the handful of frozen guests who were still present toward the exit with the practiced calm of people who did this when required. The man with the expensive suit reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the nearest table, a thick fold of bills held together with a rubber band. He didn't count it. He didn't look at her when he set it down. "Go home," he said. His voice was the same as it had been with the giant, quiet, controlled, like he had trained himself out of any register above a certain volume because volume drew attention, and he had survived this long by not drawing the wrong kind. Then he walked toward the exit. No hurry, no backward glance. His men fell in around him like planets around a point of gravity, and the front door opened and closed, and the man whose name Lena would not learn until morning was simply gone. She stood in the empty restaurant with a burned hand and a water bill 12 days overdue and a fold of cash on the table that she was fairly certain represented more money than she'd made in the last 2 months combined. She looked at the body on the floor. She looked at the cash. She picked up the cash. Later, she would ask herself many times if she'd made the right choice in that moment. Not the cash. Taking the cash was automatic. She needed it. Anyone would have taken it. She meant the other choice, the one she made when she went to the back of the kitchen, wrapped her burned hand in a dish towel, sat down on an overturned milk crate, and waited for 15 minutes to see if anyone official would come. Nobody came. When she finally pushed through the back door into the alley, the night smelled like cold rain and old concrete. Harbor City continued around her in its ordinary fashion. Distant sirens, traffic, someone's music from an open window 2 floors up. The city had no idea what had just happened inside Caruso's, and if the people being paid to clean it up did their job properly, it never would. She walked home in the rain, 23 blocks. She didn't take the bus because she needed to think, and thinking required motion, and motion required her body to be doing something other than sitting still and processing what her eyes had seen. By the time she reached her apartment building, the one with the busted intercom and the landlord who'd been promising to fix the elevator since October, she had almost convinced herself that the shock would wear off by morning. She was wrong about that too. But she didn't know it yet. She climbed 4 flights of stairs, unlocked her door with the key that always stuck slightly before the second turn, went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her hand and pressed her forehead against the mirror above the sink and looked at herself for a long time. She looked exactly the same as she had this morning. That seemed wrong somehow. It seemed like something about her face should have changed. She wrapped her hand properly, took 2 painkillers, sat on her bed in her work clothes and counted the money because not counting it felt more irresponsible than counting it. And when she was done, she sat very still for several minutes with the stack of bills in her lap. It was enough to cover rent, the water bill, the electric bill that was also overdue, the credit card minimum payment she'd been rolling for 3 months, groceries for a month, maybe more if she was careful. All of it. From one fold of cash a man had left on a table without counting it. She tried to sleep. She managed maybe 2 hours, broken and strange, full of sounds that weren't there when she opened her eyes. At some point before dawn, she got up and moved the money from the nightstand and put it inside the lining of her winter coat in the back of her closet, because hiding it felt more rational than leaving it visible. And rationality was the only thing she had left to hold on to. She made coffee, stood at the window and watched the city come awake. The delivery trucks, the early walkers, the pigeons doing whatever pigeons do at 5 in the morning. She thought about calling the police. She thought about it for a long time. Specifically, she thought about the fact that she would have to explain what she saw. She would have to explain being in the restaurant at that hour, and then explain why there were no other witnesses, and then explain the money, and then explain how she came to have it without it looking like something other than what it was. She also thought about the fact that the police had not shown up last night. Not at the restaurant, not at her building, not anywhere. She had walked 23 blocks and had not passed a single patrol car moving with purpose, which meant either nobody had called it in, possible, given that the remaining guests had been ushered out quickly, or someone had called it in and been told something that made them stop pursuing it. Neither option made the police feel like the right direction. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, thought about going back to sleep. The knock on her door came at 7:43 in the morning. She knew immediately that it wasn't her neighbor, who always knocked twice fast. It wasn't the super, who didn't knock so much as bang. It was a specific kind of knock, measured, patient, the knock of someone who was very certain you were home and was willing to wait for however long it took. She didn't answer. The knock came again, same rhythm, same patience. "Ms. Mercer," a voice said through the door, calm, male. No urgency at all, which somehow made it worse. Mr. DeLuca would like a word. She hadn't told anyone her name last night. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She had walked home alone in the rain and come upstairs and locked her door. They already knew where she lived. She looked at the closet where she'd hidden the money. She looked at the door. She looked at her burned hand wrapped in its bandage and thought about the $37 balance in her checking account and the fact that somewhere inside a winter coat lining there was enough money to change the next several months of her life. She took a breath. She opened the door. There were two of them in the hallway. Neither was especially large, neither was visibly armed. They wore the same particular kind of quiet efficiency she'd noticed in the restaurant, the kind that meant they didn't need to look dangerous, because being dangerous was simply a baseline they operated from. The one who'd knocked was maybe 40. Dark eyes. A scar she almost didn't notice along his jawline. "He'd like to speak with you," the man said again, as if the last 30 seconds hadn't happened, as if she just needed a moment to finish getting ready. "Where?" she asked. "Not far." She put on her shoes, she took her phone. She did not take the money from the coat, because if they knew where she lived and what she'd eaten for breakfast and every step she'd taken since last night, which she was becoming rapidly certain they did, then they already knew about the money, and pretending she didn't have it would only make her look more frightened than she already was. She stepped into the hallway. The door clicked shut behind her. And Lena Mercer, 22 years old, burned hand, overdue bills, 2 hours of broken sleep, walked down 4 flights of stairs between 2 men she'd never met, and into a city that had already decided she was something other than a waitress. She just didn't know what yet. The car was black and clean and smelled like leather and something faintly chemical that Lena couldn't place. She sat in the back between the 2 men, not touching either of them, her burned hand resting in her lap with the bandage already needing to be changed. The one who'd knocked at her door, the one with the scar along his jaw, sat to her left and spent the entire ride looking out the window like the city outside was a problem he was still working through. The other one drove without speaking. Nobody offered her coffee. Nobody explained where they were going. The radio wasn't on. She watched the streets through the windshield and tried to build a mental map of the turns. Left on Merchant, right on Canal. Under the overpass where the paint on the concrete had been peeling since she was a teenager. She knew this part of Harbor City the way you know a place you've spent years being too tired to leave. Every block had a specific memory attached to it that she didn't ask for. The laundromat where she'd lost a quarter in the machine and cried about it because she'd been running on 3 hours of sleep. The pharmacy where the night pharmacist always looked at her prescription receipts a half-second too long. The bus stop where the bench had been broken for going on 2 years. The car pulled off Canal onto a narrower street she didn't immediately recognize, then into an alley between 2 buildings that both looked like they'd been operating as something unremarkable for a very long time. Dry cleaning bags visible through one window, bolts of fabric stacked against another. The kind of block that exists in every city, present, functional, entirely forgettable. They stopped in front of a tailor shop. The sign above the door read Arturo's Fine Alterations in letters that had probably been repainted once in the last decade, and even then, not carefully. The window display showed 2 mannequins in suits that fit them well, which was either genuine craftsmanship or the most deliberate kind of misdirection. The man with the scar got out first and held the door. Not for her exactly, just open, the way you hold a door when you're moving through a building and someone happens to be behind you. She got out on her own. The driver stayed in the car. Inside, the shop smelled like wool and machine oil and the faint sweetness of old steam from a pressing iron. A tailor's dummy stood near the back with a half-finished jacket pinned to it. A small television mounted in the corner was on but muted, showing morning news footage she couldn't read from the angle. An older man behind the counter, small, quiet, with reading glasses pushed up into his white hair, looked up when they entered, registered them, and went back to the fabric he was measuring without a word. The man with the scar walked past the counter, through a doorway covered by a heavy curtain in a dark fabric, and Lena followed because stopping felt like a worse option than continuing. On the other side of the curtain was a different room entirely. It was not large, but it was precisely organized in the way that spaces become when someone has been using them for serious work for a long time. A long table ran along one wall with 3 laptops open on it, 2 of them active. Maps, actual paper maps, the kind nobody printed anymore, were pinned to a corkboard above the table with notations in a handwriting too small to read from the doorway. There were no windows. The lighting was overhead and flat and without opinion. 3 men. Lena didn't recognize stood or sat at various points around the room, and every single one of them looked at her when she walked in with the specific expression of people assessing a variable they hadn't been asked about. Vincenzo De Luca was standing at the far end of the table with his back to the door, looking at something on the corkboard. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished whatever he was reading first, which took maybe 4 seconds, and then he turned. He looked worse than he had last night. Not physically. The suit was different, equally expensive, equally perfect, but in his face. The tiredness she'd registered across a restaurant had compacted overnight into something denser. The lines around his eyes were deeper. His jaw carried the particular tightness of a man who had not slept and was not going to acknowledge that fact. "Sit down," he said. There was one chair near the corner that wasn't occupied or covered with files. Lena sat in it, mostly because her legs had decided that standing was optional at this point. She put her burned hand in her lap and waited. Vincenzo pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down across from her. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand without showing that you're trying. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I'm not anything," she said. "I'm a waitress." One of the men along the wall made a small sound, not quite a laugh. Vincenzo didn't react to it. "You were," he said. "That's the problem." She looked at him steadily. "I want to go home." "I know. So tell me what this is and let me leave." He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone collecting their thoughts, more like someone who had already thought through everything and was deciding how much of that thinking to share. "The man you killed last night," he began. "I didn't kill anyone. A cart tipped over." "The man who died as a result of the cart tipping over," Vincenzo said, without any particular inflection, "was called Bran Kovac. He worked for the Moretti Syndicate for 11 years. He was their most effective—" He paused, chose a word. "Instrument. They sent him specifically. They do not send him for small problems." Lena said nothing. "By this morning, they know he's dead. By this afternoon, they'll know how. By tonight, they'll know who." He looked at her steadily. "They are very good at knowing things." "I don't know anything about any syndicate," she said. "I don't know anything about any of this. I was carrying soup." "Yes." He said it simply, like that fact was the core of the entire problem, rather than a detail in her favor. "You were carrying soup. You have no connection to me, no history in this world, no protection, no leverage, no reason to be involved in any of this. And you are now the person who killed Bran Kovac." He let that settle for exactly 1 second. "That makes you a problem. Not for me. For yourself." The room was very quiet. One of the laptops made a small notification sound that nobody moved to check. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means the woman named Lena Mercer, who works at Caruso's on the corner of 5th and Merchant, no longer exists in any safe sense of that word," he said. "The Moretti Syndicate will find her. They will not ask her questions. They are not interested in explanations about carts and soup." Her stomach dropped in the particular way it does when something that was abstract becomes suddenly specific. "You're saying they'll kill me." "I'm saying they already want to," he said. "Wanting and doing are separated by logistics and time. Right now you have a small window of both." She looked around the room. The 3 men were still watching her, each in his own way. The one with the scar had positioned himself near the curtained doorway. Nobody in the room looked like someone she could appeal to. "So what do you want from me?" she asked. Vincenzo's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted slightly. "I want to offer you a choice, which is more than most people in your position receive." "My position," she repeated. "You disappear," he said. "Completely. New documentation, new city, new life. We can arrange it within 48 hours. You take the cash you already have, you add to it what I'll provide, and you go somewhere the Moretti name means nothing. She stared at him. Or? He looked at her for a moment like he was recalibrating something. Or you stay, under my protection, which is, as of last night, the most comprehensive protection available in this city. And do what? What you were apparently already doing at that restaurant, he said. Pay attention, notice things. We'll discuss the specifics. She almost laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, and she pressed it down. You want me to work for you? I want to not be responsible for your death, he said, and the flatness of it was somehow more unsettling than if he'd dressed it up. Those are not the same thing, but they overlap. I don't even know your name. The man with the scar made that sound again. This time, two of the other men looked at him. He went expressionless. Vincenzo's jaw moved slightly. Vincenzo de Luca. She knew the name. She'd heard it the way everyone in Harbor City had heard it, attached to a story, half rumor, usually shared in the tone people use when they want to seem like they know things they probably don't. The De Luca family. The North Side. The man you didn't name too loud in certain rooms. She had never expected to be sitting 4 feet away from him while her hand burned under a dish towel bandage. How do I know you won't kill me once I'm useful enough or not useful enough? She asked. The room shifted again. Not dramatically. Nobody reached for anything. Nobody changed their posture by more than a degree. But the quality of the attention sharpened. Vincenzo looked at her for a long moment. You don't, he said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks, which said something about her weeks that she didn't want to examine too closely. She looked at her burned hand. She thought about the apartment with the stuck lock and the elevator that had been broken since October. She thought about the water bill and the electric bill and the credit card she'd been managing like a slow leak in a boat she was still trying to row. She thought about the 48 hours he'd described, new documentation, new city, and tried to construct a real image of it and found she couldn't. She had no people to say goodbye to. Her mother was in a facility in the south part of the state that she visited twice a year because that was what she could afford. She had co-workers but not friends. She had a life that was primarily defined by what it was not yet, always not yet. I need to get medicine for my hand, she said. We have medical supplies here. I need to think. That's fair. Not here. Somewhere I can breathe. He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded, once to the man with the scar. Marco will take you to get what you need, he said. He'll wait outside. You won't be alone, but you won't be supervised. He picked up a pen from the table and uncapped it. I'll need an answer by tonight. She stood. Her legs worked fine, which surprised her slightly. Mr. De Luca, she said. He looked up. If I say no, she said. If I take the 48 hours and the new city, what happens to you? It was a strange question, and she wasn't entirely sure why she'd asked it. Something about his face when she'd asked it made her think he wasn't entirely sure either. The same thing that was happening to me before you walked into Caruso's, he said. She left with Marco and didn't ask him any questions on the drive to the pharmacy, and he didn't offer any. She bought gauze and medical tape and antiseptic and a bottle of ibuprofen, and Marco stood by the car with his hands in his pockets and looked at the traffic. And she stood in the pharmacy aisle for a long time looking at the shelf without reading any of the labels. She didn't buy anything else. She got back in the car. What she did not know, as the car pulled back into traffic on Canal Street, was that at that exact moment, 2 men sitting in a parked vehicle 4 blocks from her apartment building were transmitting her photograph to a number in a different area code. The photograph had been taken that morning from across the street as she'd walked out with Marco and the other man. It was a clear shot, good light. She was identifiable in it without any question. The number it was sent to belonged to someone who worked for the Moretti Syndicate's operations manager, a man named Carver, who had never personally appeared in any police report or news item or criminal database, and who intended to keep it that way. Within 20 minutes of receiving the photograph, Carver had confirmed the identity. Within 40, he had an address. Lena arrived back at the tailor shop and gave Vincenzo her answer before he'd finished whatever he was reading. I'll stay, she said from the doorway. He didn't look surprised. She didn't know whether that meant he'd expected it or whether he'd simply trained himself not to look surprised at anything. Good, he said. I have conditions. He set down the paper. Tell me. I'm not carrying a gun. I don't know how to use one, and I'll probably hurt myself or someone who doesn't deserve it. Fine. I want to know what I'm doing and why. Not the whole picture, But what affects me directly? He considered this for a moment. Agreed, within reason. And I want a real bed, not a cot in a basement. Something moved across his face that might have been the structural memory of a smile. That can be arranged. She sat down. Marco brought coffee that she hadn't asked for but drank anyway, and it was better coffee than anything she'd made herself in the last year, which felt like an inappropriate detail to focus on, but she focused on it anyway because her brain needed somewhere ordinary to land. Over the next hour, a man named Felix, mid-30s, wire-rimmed glasses, the kind of quiet that comes from spending a lot of time with numbers, walked her through what she would actually be doing. The organization operated several legitimate businesses as a functional network: a linen supply company, a parking structure, 2 commercial cleaning contracts with office buildings on the north side, and a restaurant supply distributor that had nothing to do with Caruso's. These businesses had their own employees, their own payroll, their own tax filings. They also had a second set of books that ran beneath the first like a river under ice, and those books had problems. What kind of problems? She asked. Felix slid a folder across the table. She opened it. Column after column of figures, transfers, invoices. She was not an accountant. She had taken 1 semester of bookkeeping at a community college 2 years ago before dropping it because she couldn't afford the next semester. But she could read numbers the way some people read faces. She always knew when they didn't add up. "Someone's skimming," she said. Felix looked at her. Then he looked at Vincenzo, who was standing near the corkboard again with his back partly turned. "We believe so," Felix said carefully. "This one." She pointed to a line of figures in the 3rd column without touching the paper. "This transfer. It repeats every 3rd cycle, but the amount shifts each time in a pattern that looks random but isn't. Someone's pulling a percentage and staggering the timing to hide the regularity." The room was quiet in a different way than it had been before. "How much have you been losing?" she asked. Felix cleared his throat. "We're not certain." "Roughly." He glanced at Vincenzo again. Vincenzo turned and looked at Lena with that same evaluative expression she was starting to recognize. "Monthly," Felix said, "somewhere between 60 and 80,000. She did the math and sat with it for a moment. "For how long?" "We think 14 months. She closed the folder and pushed it back. "You think?" "We didn't notice it until 3 months ago," Felix said, and he had the particular tone of someone delivering bad news he's personally embarrassed about. "Who has access to this system?" "That's what we're trying to determine." "How many people?" 11. Across 3 of the business entities. She nodded slowly. She looked at the folder. She thought about the skimming pattern she'd spotted in roughly 40 seconds of looking at raw numbers. She thought about the fact that nobody in this room, with all their resources and all their men and all their maps on the corkboard, had caught it for 14 months. "I'll need a secure workstation," she said, "and I'll need Felix to walk me through the full ledger structure, not just the summary. And I'll need people to stop looking at me like I'm going to disappear in the night." That last part she said to the room generally. Marco, near the doorway, had the grace to look at the floor. She spent the rest of the afternoon in the back room with Felix, not talking much, mostly going through figures in a focused silence that she found, to her own mild surprise, something close to calming. Numbers didn't deceive the way people did. They held their lies differently, mechanical, traceable, always leaving a thread if you knew how to look for it. By early evening, she had identified 3 potential sources of the leak. Not confirmed, she needed more access and more time, but probable enough that Felix had stopped making his careful throat-clearing sounds and had started writing things down without being asked. At some point, Marco brought food. She ate without tasting it. It was nearly 9 at night when she realized she hadn't thought about running in several hours. That realization sat with her uncomfortably, because it meant something about her had already adjusted to this room and these people in a way she hadn't consciously agreed to. And she wasn't sure whether that was adaptation or something more permanent starting to take root. She was saved from thinking about it too long by Marco appearing at the doorway with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, tight, controlled, the look of someone carrying information they'd rather not deliver. "Mr. DeLuca." He didn't say anything else, just the name, as a signal. Vincenzo set down what he was holding, looked at Marco. "When?" "Hour ago. They're certain it's her." Lena looked up from the folder. Vincenzo looked at her briefly. Something passed through his eyes. Not apology, exactly. more like confirmation of something he'd already known was coming and had hoped might arrive later than this. "The Moretti people have your address," he said. She stared at him. "They photographed you this morning," he said. "Outside your building." She thought about the drive to the pharmacy. The way Marco had stood by the car, the traffic moving normally around them. She'd been looking at gauze in a pharmacy aisle, and someone had been pointing a camera at her face from across the street. "My things," she said. "We can send someone. My mother's number is in a notebook in my nightstand drawer." She heard her own voice say it and registered that it was steady, which was interesting because nothing else in her felt steady at all. "That's all I need." Marco nodded and left before she finished the sentence. Vincenzo was still looking at her. The room had cleared slightly. Felix had gathered his papers. The other men had moved to the outer area with the muted television. It was just the two of them, and the flat overhead light, and the maps on the corkboard. "I'm not going to tell you this isn't serious," he said. "Good." She closed the folder in front of her. "Because I'm not in the mood for that." He was quiet for a moment. "You handled today better than most people would have. I've had practice with bad days. This is a different category." "I know." She looked at her bandaged hand. "Mr. DeLuca, the 48 hours you mentioned, the new city." "Yes." "Is it still available?" He looked at her carefully. "Do you want it to be?" She thought about her apartment, the stuck lock, the broken elevator, the notebook in the nightstand with her mother's number written in her own handwriting from 2 years ago when she'd been afraid her phone would die and she'd lose it. The specific smallness of a life that had been built entirely out of things she was surviving rather than things she was choosing. She looked at the folder of numbers. "No," she said. It came out quiet and clear, and entirely without the hesitation she expected. Vincenzo nodded once. Outside, somewhere in the city, a man named Carver had already dispatched 2 people to an apartment building on a street Lena would never sleep in again. And when they found the place empty, they would report back, and the calculation would shift from passive surveillance to something with edges that she couldn't fully see yet, but that were already moving toward her through the dark. She was no longer a waitress who had been in the wrong place. She was a person who had made a choice. And in Vincenzo De Luca's world, those were the only 2 categories that mattered, and there was no road between them that ran in both directions. They moved her that night. Not to the penthouse, not yet. That came later, after things got worse in ways she hadn't thought to anticipate. That first night, they put her in a room above a dry cleaning operation 3 blocks from the tailor shop, a space that had been used for exactly this purpose before, and showed it. A bed with a clean mattress and no headboard. A lamp. A window that looked out at a brick wall 4 feet away. A bathroom with water pressure that came and went on its own schedule. Marco brought the notebook from her nightstand before midnight. He set it on the bed without comment and left. She picked it up and held it without opening it, and then put it in her jacket pocket and didn't think about it further because thinking about it further would pull a thread she needed to leave alone. She slept 6 hours, solid and dreamless, which surprised her enough that she lay there for a moment after waking, checking herself the way you check a structure after a storm, looking for damage before you start moving around in it. She was intact. That was the most she could say. Felix arrived at 7 in the morning with coffee and a laptop and a folding table that he set up in the corner of the room without asking if the location was acceptable. She didn't object. How was this closest thing to a neutral presence she'd found inside Vincenzo's world? A man who communicated primarily through organized information and appeared to find most human drama an interruption to the actual work. "Full ledger access?" she asked. He opened the laptop, turned it to face her. "Everything going back 4 years." She sat down, tucked her legs under the chair, and started reading. The structure was more complex than she'd understood from the summary folder. Multiple entities, some legitimate, some operating in the space between legitimate and something she didn't have a clean word for. Invoicing between related companies that sometimes moved real goods and services and sometimes moved numbers that needed to be somewhere other than where they started. She had understood this intellectually from the previous evening. Looking at the actual mechanism of it across 4 years of records was a different experience. It was like looking at a machine that had been running for a long time. You could see where the grease was worn, where the tolerances had gotten sloppy, where someone had made a repair with the wrong part and hoped nobody would look too closely. Someone had. For 14 months, they'd been helping themselves to the imprecision. Walk me through the ownership structure of the linen company, she said. Felix walked her through it. She asked questions and he answered them with the specific economy of a person who respects well-asked questions, and she asked more. And by mid-morning, she had built a working picture in her head of the whole network. Not all the details, but the shape, the logic of it, the points where information would have to pass through specific hands. 11 people with access, she said, but not equal access. Correct. 3 of them have access to all 3 entities simultaneously. She looked at the screen. Who authorized that? Felix adjusted his glasses. 2 were authorized by Mr. DeLuca directly. 1 was authorized by his chief of operations. Who's his chief of operations? A man named Sal Ricci. He's been with the organization for 16 years. She wrote the name down. Then she wrote down the names of the other 2. She looked at all 3. I need transaction logs for these 3 accounts specifically, she said. Not the summary, the raw logs, time-stamped. Felix looked at her for a moment in the way he did when he was deciding whether to push back on something. He'd done it twice the previous evening, and both times had decided against it. He did the same now, opened another window, and started pulling files. She was 3 hours into the raw logs when the door opened, and it wasn't Felix or Marco. It was a man she hadn't seen before. Broad through the chest, moving with the kind of ease that comes from physical confidence. Maybe 50, maybe a little less. His face had the pleasant openness of someone who has learned that appearing friendly is the most efficient way to move through rooms without being examined. He was wearing a jacket that fit well and carrying 2 cups of coffee that he hadn't needed to bring because Felix had a thermos on the table that was still half full. You must be the waitress, he said. His voice was warm. The warmth was something he was doing rather than something he had. Lena looked at him. Then she looked at Felix, who had gone very still in the particular way that people go still when they're trying not to give information through their body. Who are you? She asked. Sal Ricci? He set both coffees on the table near the door like an offering he wasn't pushing. Vincenzo told me you were here. I wanted to introduce myself. She looked at him for 2 full seconds. Then she looked back at the screen. I'm in the middle of something, she said. Of course. He didn't move to leave. He picked up one of the coffees and held it. Felix, can you give us a minute? Felix closed his laptop immediately and stood, which told her everything she needed to know about where Sal Ricci sat in this organization. Felix was not a man who moved quickly for people who didn't have authority over him. He gathered his things with the efficiency of someone who'd been asked to leave rooms before and had learned to do it cleanly, and then he was gone, and she was alone with the man whose name she had written down 20 minutes ago. She kept her eyes on the screen. You found something, Ricci said. It wasn't a question. I've been looking at ledgers for 3 hours, she said. I haven't found anything conclusive yet. But you have a direction. She turned and looked at him directly. His face was still pleasant. His eyes were doing something different from his face. Why would you ask me that? She said. He smiled. Because Felix doesn't go still like that when someone's looking at irrelevant data. He gestured vaguely at the screen. He goes still like that when someone's getting close to something he's been told is sensitive. Has Felix been told something is sensitive? Felix has been told lots of things, Ricci said. He's a careful man. He organizes information the way other people organize their homes. Everything in its place. He gets uncomfortable when someone starts moving the furniture. She turned fully to face him. Her burned hand was under the table. She was aware of it. Mr. Ricci, she said, I don't know you. I don't know what your position is relative to this investigation or to Mr. DeLuca's trust in you. What I do know is that I was asked to look at a financial problem, and I'm looking at it. I'll share what I find with Mr. DeLuca directly. Something moved through his expression, very quick, very controlled. Of course, he said. He picked up the second coffee cup and set it near her without being asked. Welcome to the organization, Ms. Mercer. He said it warmly and without edge and left the room. She waited until she heard the door at the bottom of the stairs close. Then she looked at the coffee he'd left and didn't touch it. She looked at the door. She looked at the screen. She pulled up Ricci's transaction authorizations. It took her 40 minutes to find the first one, another 20 to find the second. By the time Felix came back, quietly, without knocking, sitting down and opening his laptop like nothing had interrupted them, she had found 7 transactions authorized under Ricci's credentials that followed the same staggered pattern she'd identified the previous evening. Same percentage. Same timing logic. Slightly different amounts, deliberately varied. She didn't say anything to Felix immediately. She wrote the transaction IDs in her notebook and closed the screen she'd been looking at and opened a different one. "Felix," she said. "Yes." "How long have you worked for Mr. DeLuca?" 8 years. "And in 8 years, has anyone inside the organization been caught stealing from it?" Felix was quiet for a moment. "Once, 4 years ago, a man who handled the parking structure accounts." "What happened to him?" Another pause, longer. "He's no longer with the organization," Felix said carefully. She nodded slowly. She understood what carefully meant in this context. "And the investigation that found him, who ran it?" Felix looked at her over his glasses. "Mr. Ricci," he said. "He's very thorough." She closed the laptop. She needed to get to Vincenzo before Ricci did, which meant she needed to do it now, because Ricci had already been in this room and had already assessed how much she knew from the way Felix's body had answered a question Felix's mouth hadn't. She needed to move, and she needed to do it without making it visible that she was moving. She told Felix she needed the bathroom and took her notebook with her, which was the kind of move that either looked casual or looked exactly like what it was depending on who was watching. She went to the bathroom, ran the tap, stood with her back against the wall for 30 seconds, and thought through it again from the beginning because she needed to be certain before she put this in front of Vincenzo. The pattern was real. She hadn't manufactured it out of stress or circumstance or the need to be useful. The numbers did what they did, regardless of who was looking at them. And what they did was move money from Vincenzo DeLuca's organization into accounts that she hadn't yet traced, but that had Sal Ricci's authorization on the earliest layer of every transaction, 14 months, 60 to 80,000 per month. She did the math, and the number it produced was large enough that she stood with it for a moment before moving. She came out of the bathroom and walked down the stairs and knocked on the door at the bottom, rather than opening it, and Marco opened it from the other side with the expression of someone who hadn't expected the knock. "I need to see Mr. DeLuca," she said. "Now, not in an hour." Marco read her face. Whatever he found there was enough. He made a call from the hallway while she waited, brief, 2 sentences. Then he looked at her and said, "Car's out front." She got in the car and didn't speak during the drive, and Marco didn't ask her to. They went back through Canal Street, different route this time, ending at a building she hadn't been to before. A legitimate-looking office building on the north side, 3 floors, the kind of place that housed small financial firms and architectural practices and generated no specific associations in anyone's mind. Vincenzo was on the 2nd floor in a room with actual windows, which felt like a significant upgrade from the no-window spaces she'd been occupying. I was on the phone when she came in, looked at her when Marco appeared in the doorway, said 2 words into the phone and ended the call. "You have something," he said. She sat down across from him and put her notebook on the table and opened it to the page with the transaction IDs. She walked him through it without editorializing, without inflection, the same way she'd have explained a discrepancy in a restaurant's end-of-night drawer. "Here is what I see. Here is the pattern. Here is where the authorization originates." She gave him numbers. She gave him dates. She gave him the name at the end of the chain. Vincenzo listened without interrupting. His hands were flat on the table, same as the tailor shop. His face did less than she'd have expected. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds. 15. She counted. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain about the pattern. I haven't traced the destination accounts yet. That requires access I don't have. But the authorization is consistent across all 7 transactions I identified this morning." She paused. "There may be more. I'd need more time." He looked at the notebook. He didn't touch it. "Sal Ricci came to see me this morning," she said, "before I found any of this." Vincenzo's eyes came up. "He wanted to know what direction I was looking," she said. "He asked me to share findings with him directly. He was very warm about it." The quality of the silence changed again. She was getting better at reading its variations. "How did he know you were there?" Vincenzo said. His voice had dropped slightly. Not louder. The opposite. "He said you told him." Vincenzo was looking at her, and she could see him working through something behind his eyes. Not doubt of her, exactly, but the particular calculation of a man who is discovering the shape of something he'd been unable to see from the inside. "I didn't tell him," Vincenzo said. The room held that statement for a moment. "Then someone did." she said. He stood up. Not abruptly, controlled, deliberate. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking at the street below, and she could see the tension running through his shoulders and the way he breathed. One slow breath, deliberately taken, the kind you make when you need to keep your hands from doing something. He picked up his phone, made a call, said 3 words in Italian she didn't understand and ended it. Then he turned around. I need you to go back to the room, he said. Stay with Felix. Don't discuss this with anyone. Mr. DeLuca, I understand what you've shown me, he said. I need an hour. She stood up. She took the notebook. Leave the notebook, he said. She set it on the table, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. The man Ricci investigated 4 years ago, she said, the one who's no longer with the organization. Do you know if he was actually stealing? Vincenzo looked at her. Because if Ricci ran that investigation, she said, and Ricci has been doing what these records suggest for 14 months, then the question is whether Ricci found a guilty man 4 years ago or whether he found a convenient one. She left before he answered. She wasn't sure he had one. The drive back to the dry cleaning building felt longer than it was. Marco drove without speaking, and she sat in the back and looked at the city moving past the window and tried to settle her breathing into something regular. It wasn't working especially well. Her hand was throbbing under the bandage, and she'd forgotten to take the ibuprofen that morning, which felt like a failure of basic self-maintenance that somehow represented a larger pattern she didn't have the energy to examine. Felix was where she'd left him. He looked at her when she came in, looked at the fact that she no longer had the notebook, and said nothing. She sat down, opened the laptop, stared at the screen without reading it. Felix, she said. Yes. When Ricci came up here this morning, who let him in the building? Felix looked at his hands. He has access to all the safe houses. All of them. He manages operational security, Felix said, and there was something in his voice now, very subtle, the kind of thing she would have missed 2 days ago, that told her he had been sitting with his own version of this discomfort for longer than this morning. Has done for 11 years. She looked at the screen and thought about what it meant for a man to manage operational security for 11 years inside an organization while simultaneously stealing from it. The patience required, the discipline, the specific coldness of sitting across tables from the man whose trust you were burning through, month after month, and maintaining the warmth in your voice. She thought about the way Ricci had set that second coffee cup down near her, a gesture that had looked like courtesy, and probably was, in the sense that everything he did was designed to look like something other than what it was. Her phone, the burner Marco had given her the night before, buzzed once. A text from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words, "Get out of there." She stared at the screen. Then she heard it. Movement on the stairs below. Not Marco's particular rhythm. Something heavier. More than one person. She looked at Felix. Felix had gone completely still, the kind of still that is past the point of decision, past the point of pretending the sound is something else. "Felix," she said quietly, "is there another way out of this room?" He looked at her. His face had lost all the careful neutrality she'd come to read as his baseline. What was underneath it was something she recognized. The expression of a man who has been waiting for a day he hoped wouldn't come, and has just understood that it has. "There's a window," he said, "back of the bathroom. Drops onto the roof of the cleaners below. From there you can get to the alley." She was already moving. She got 3 steps toward the bathroom when the door at the bottom of the stairs came open with the particular sound of force rather than request. And then there were footsteps, fast, purposeful, not trying to be quiet anymore. And she understood that the time for quiet had passed for everyone. She went through the bathroom door and locked it, and crossed to the window in 4 steps and got it open. Stiff, painted over at some point, and never properly freed, she had to hit the frame twice with the heel of her unburned hand before it gave, and looked down at the flat roof of the dry cleaning shop, a 6-foot drop onto a surface she couldn't fully assess from above. Behind her, the bathroom door took its first impact from the other side. She went through the window. The landing was harder than she'd planned for. Her left ankle turned slightly on a raised seam in the roof material, and she went down on one knee, scraped her palm, pushed herself up before she'd finished registering the pain. The roof was flat and ran the width of the building and ended at a low parapet above the alley. She crossed it in 8 steps and looked over the edge. The alley below was empty. 10 feet, maybe 12. Concrete. The bathroom window she'd come through shuddered as the door behind it gave. She climbed over the parapet and dropped. She hit the concrete and rolled the way she'd seen done once in a film she'd watched on a laptop with a cracked hinge. And it worked approximately the way it had in the film, except with significantly more impact than the film had suggested, and she came up against the alley wall with her shoulder aching and her ankle still complaining and her burned hand screaming under the bandage. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand up. The alley opened onto a side street to her left. She turned left and walked fast, but not running because running draws attention, and she was operating now on some layer of instinct that had apparently been sitting dormant under 9 months of soup trays and overdue bills, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. She turned her face away from the camera mounted above the dry cleaner's rear exit. She put her hands in her pockets. She walked. The burner phone buzzed again. Canal and 9th. Blue door. Knocked twice. She walked 14 blocks without looking back, and the city moved around her with total indifference. A delivery truck blocking an intersection, 2 women arguing about something at a bus stop, a man eating lunch on the steps of an office building with his face turned up toward whatever weak sun was managing to break through the cloud cover. She found Canal and 9th, found the blue door, which was recessed in a building she would have passed 100 times without noticing. She knocked twice. The door opened. Marco was on the other side. Behind him was a space that smelled like machine oil and old paper and had no windows she could see. He looked at her. At the scraped palm, the shoulder she was holding slightly wrong, the overall state of someone who had recently exited a building via the roof, and his jaw tightened. "Ricci's men," she said. "I know." "Felix, he's fine. He went out the front. They weren't there for Felix." His eyes were doing that careful calculation she'd seen in the restaurant. "They were there for you." She understood the implication and let it settle. Not for the ledgers. Not for what she'd already shared with Vincenzo. For her specifically, which meant Ricci already knew she'd given the name to Vincenzo, which meant either the room on the second floor had been compromised, or someone on that floor had made a call the moment she'd left. And either way, the time between her showing Vincenzo the notebook and Ricci sending men to the dry cleaner building had been less than 40 minutes. "Where is he?" she asked. "On his way," Marco said. "Ricci?" "De Luca." She sat down on a crate because her ankle needed a moment, and she was tired enough that pretending otherwise felt like a waste of energy she couldn't spare. Marco stood near the door and didn't try to fill the silence with anything, which she was starting to appreciate about him. She looked at her hands. The scrape on her palm was bleeding slightly. The burn on the other hand pulsed with its own separate complaint. She was 22 years old, and she had been inside this world for less than 48 hours, and already had people coming through doors specifically to collect her. She thought about the 48 hours Vincenzo had offered her the first morning. New documentation, new city. The version of this where she was somewhere other than a windowless room waiting for a man whose chief of operations had just tried to have her grabbed. She thought about it the way you think about a road you passed without taking, with a clean, specific recognition that the turn was behind you and the distance was only growing. The blue door opened and Vincenzo came through it, and he was different than he'd been in the office with the windows. The control was still there, but it was working harder, and his jaw was carrying something she hadn't seen in it before. Not anger exactly. Closer to the feeling that comes when something you suspected but refused to confirm has confirmed itself in a way that removed the last reasonable doubt. He looked at her for a moment. At the scraped hand. At the shoulder. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I've been worse," she said, which was not strictly true but felt like the right answer for this moment. He sat down on the other side of the space and looked at the floor briefly and then looked up at her. "Ricci is gone," he said. "He left the North Side building 12 minutes after you did. He has people we haven't accounted for, people I didn't know he had." He said it evenly, but beneath the evenness was something that cost him. The specific cost of discovering that trust had been systematically converted into a weapon and used against you for over a year. "My lieutenant is dead." He said it without transition, without softening. "They found him an hour ago." She looked at him. "Sal did it," Vincenzo said, "or arranged it. The timing is—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together. "The timing makes it clear." The room was very quiet. She thought about the man Ricci had investigated 4 years ago. The convenient guilty party. The organization that had been losing 60 to 80,000 a month for 14 months, while the man responsible for finding the leak was the leak. The architecture of it was almost elegant in the specific way that terrible things are sometimes elegant, built carefully, over time, by someone who understood the structure well enough to exploit its every assumption. "What do you need from me?" she said. Vincenzo looked at her. Something in his face shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating around a new fact about her. "The destination accounts," he said. "The ones you couldn't trace this morning. I need access I don't have. You'll have it. And I need to not be in a building that Ricci's people can walk into. That's already handled." He looked at Marco. Something passed between them. "You're coming with me." She stood up, her ankle held, her hand burned. She was operating on bad sleep and no breakfast, and the specific exhausted clarity that comes from having all your options removed until only one remains. She had walked into this city's criminal machinery by accident, holding a tray of soup. She was still inside it now, but the nature of the situation had changed in a way that had no polite description. She was not being protected by Vincenzo De Luca anymore in any arrangement that resembled a transaction. She was necessary. And somewhere in the city, a man named Sal Ricci, who had been stealing from the most powerful criminal organization in Harbor City for over a year and had just murdered the organization's second-in-command, was looking at the same 48 hours she was, doing his own mathematics, arriving at his own conclusions about what needed to happen next and in what order. She picked up her jacket. She walked toward the door. And the version of Lena Mercer who had spent 9 months carrying soup and pretending that survival was the same thing as living followed her out into the street and quietly ceased to exist. The penthouse was on the 14th floor of a building that appeared, from the outside, to belong to a mid-range hospitality group that operated 3 hotels in Harbor City and paid its taxes on time. The lobby had a front desk and a man behind it who nodded at Vincenzo without speaking. The elevator required a key that Marco produced. The 14th floor had no other doors on it besides one, and that door was steel behind a wooden exterior and opened into a space that felt less like a residence and more like a place someone had furnished for the purpose of extended survival. Wide, sparse, a long window running the length of the north wall that showed the city in both directions, the grid of it, the light starting to come on as the afternoon went gray. A kitchen that was functional without being domestic. A table large enough to work at. A couch that looked like it had been chosen for its capacity to hold sleeping men rather than for any aesthetic reason. 2 of Vincenzo's men were already there when they arrived. She didn't know their names. They stood when Vincenzo came through the door and sat back down when he gestured, and she was beginning to understand that this was the register of the organization right now. Reduced, tight, operating on compressed trust that had been further compressed by the morning's events. Marco brought her to a back room and left her with clean bandaging materials and an instruction to change the dressing on her hand, which she did sitting on the edge of a bed that was real and had a headboard and was, in fact, the best bed she'd seen in the last 3 days. She unwrapped the old bandage. The burn was doing what burns do, red and tight and honest about its discomfort. She cleaned it with the antiseptic, rebandaged it properly, and sat for a moment with her ankle elevated on the frame of the bed, testing whether it would hold weight normally. It would, barely. She came back out and found Vincenzo at the table with a phone and a glass of water he hadn't touched. He looked up when she came in. "Felix is secure," he said. "He's being moved." "Good." He also pulled the destination account data before he left. "The access we discussed." He slid a folded paper across the table. "He said you'd know what to do with it." She sat down and unfolded the paper. Raw account numbers. Routing information. 3 columns of data in Felix's precise handwriting. Tight, small, consistent. She looked at the numbers and began building the structure in her head the way she'd been doing all morning, the way she apparently did now when presented with financial data, assembling the shape of it before she started pulling at any specific thread. "How long?" Vincenzo asked. "To trace them properly?" "Hours." "To tell you where they're going in broad terms?" She looked at the columns. 20 minutes. He nodded. He left her alone with it. She worked at the table while the city outside went fully dark and someone, she didn't see who, put a plate of food near her that she ate without looking at it. The numbers resolved slowly, layer by layer. Shell companies were like rooms inside rooms. You opened one door and found another, and the only way through was patience and the understanding that someone had built this with the assumption that most people would stop after the third door. She didn't stop. 14 minutes in, she found the first clean account. Not a shell. An actual operating account registered under a holding company with a real address in a real city 2 states north. She wrote it down. 19 minutes in, she found the second. Same state, different city, different company name, but the registration structure was identical. Same filing date format, same registered agent category. Someone had used the same template and not bothered to vary it enough. Mr. DeLuca, she said. He came from the window where he'd been standing. She turned the paper so he could see it. The money is going north, both accounts, same structure. Whoever set these up used a template. The filings are too similar to be coincidence. She pointed to the registration dates. These were open 9 months before the skimming started. Richie planned this before he started taking. She looked up. This wasn't impulsive. This was a 5-year project. Vincenzo looked at the paper for a long time. His face was doing very little, which she now understood meant it was doing a great deal. He was building an exit, Vincenzo said. That would be my read. He was going to take what he needed and disappear. He may still be planning to. She looked at him. Which means he has a timeline. And if the timeline has been disrupted by today, she didn't finish the sentence because she didn't need to. Vincenzo pulled out his phone. What happened next moved faster than she was built for. He made 2 calls in rapid succession, both brief, both in a mix of English and Italian, that she caught partial meanings from. A name she didn't recognize, a location, the word now used in both languages. Then he put the phone down and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. I need you to stay here, he said. Where are you going? To find out if we still have anyone in Ricci's access points. He said it carefully, the way you say a thing when the saying of it forces you to confront its full weight. He's been managing my operational security for 11 years. He knows every location, every safe house, every... He stopped. Every route, she said. Yes. The implications of that landed in the room and sat there. He knows about this building, she said. He knows about every building. Then why are we still in it? Because we have nowhere to go that he doesn't also know about, Vincenzo said. And it was the flattest, most honest accounting of their situation that he'd given her yet. We're not hiding from him. We're moving faster than he can reposition. She looked at the window. The city below was doing what cities do at night. Indifferent, lit, continuous. The Moretti Syndicate, she said. Are they still active in this? Yes. And Ricci is likely in contact with them. He said it like he'd been sitting with this conclusion for hours and had arrived at it only recently enough that saying it out loud still cost something. I don't know for how long. She thought about that, about what it meant for the last 11 years, about the specific patience required to embed yourself in someone's trust so completely that they made you responsible for the walls around them, and then quietly showed the people outside where the doors were. 16 years, she said. What? Felix said Ricci had been with you for 16 years. Vincenzo said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. That was all. She stood up. Then we need to move. Now. Not because he knows this building, because if he's coordinating with Moretti and he knows you're compromised and cornered, then the window where you can still act before they act is getting smaller every minute we're having this conversation. He looked at her. Something in the look had changed from the previous days. Less of the evaluative quality. More of something that resembled what people who trusted each other looked like. She didn't know what to do with it and didn't have time to figure it out. Marco, Vincenzo called. Marco appeared from the kitchen doorway. He'd been there the whole time. She wondered briefly how much of this he'd heard, and then decided it didn't matter because Marco was clearly the kind of man who'd heard everything in every room he'd been in for years and had kept it exactly where it belonged. We need the Altieri building, Vincenzo said. Marco's expression moved slightly. That's been dark for 8 months. I know. Ricci would know that too, which is why he won't expect us to use it. Vincenzo was already moving, picking up the phone from the table, a jacket from the back of the couch. Call the 2 men downstairs. We go in 20 minutes. Marco disappeared. Lena folded Felix's paper and put it in her jacket pocket. She looked at the plate she'd eaten from, the bandage on her hand, The bed in the back room she'd sat on for 6 minutes. She thought about the notebook she'd left on Vincenzo's table in the office building, the one with her transaction notes in it, the one she'd given up without thinking because the moment had required it. She hoped it was somewhere useful rather than somewhere Ricci's people had already collected it. She put on her jacket. They went out through a service exit she hadn't come in through and into a different alley than the one that had brought them here. 2 cars. She went in the first with Vincenzo and Marco. The other 2 men followed. The city moved around them with its usual indifference, and she sat in the back and watched the mirrors without being asked to. Nothing followed them, or nothing she could see, which was a different thing, and she was beginning to understand the difference. The Altieri building was in the warehouse district, the part of Harbor City that had been slated for redevelopment twice, and both times had stalled at the funding stage, leaving it in the specific limbo of places that are too expensive to demolish and not profitable enough to rebuild. The building itself was 4 stories of brick that had once processed something industrial and now processed nothing. The ground floor windows were boarded. The loading dock had a padlock that Marco opened with a key he carried separately from his other keys. Inside smelled like cold concrete and undisturbed air. The beam from Marco's flashlight moved across the floor, clear of debris except at the edges, the outline of old equipment pads still visible in the concrete. The space was large enough to lose your voice in. They went to the second floor via a staircase that held their weight with complaints it didn't act on. The second floor had been used for something more recently than the ground floor. A folding table was still there, 2 chairs, a power strip connected to nothing. Marco produced a battery lantern from somewhere, and the space became dim and real. Vincenzo sat down. Lena sat across from him. Marco positioned himself near the staircase. "How many people do you actually trust right now?" she asked. He looked at the lantern rather than at her. "In this room?" "In general." He was quiet for a moment. 3, maybe 4. "Felix?" "Yes." "Marco?" "Yes." She nodded. "Then that's what you're working with. Whatever comes next has to be built on 3 or 4 people and whatever information I pulled this afternoon." She looked at him. "Is that enough?" "It's what there is." "Then yes," she said. "It's enough." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the restaurant when she'd pushed herself upright off the floor without taking his hand, like she was a fact he was still updating his understanding around. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed, not dramatically. A compression, specifically around the eyes. "What?" she asked. "The Moretti leadership," he said. "They've called a meeting. Tomorrow morning." He set the phone down. "With Ricci." The room was very cold and very still. She understood what that meant structurally, understood it the way she'd understood the numbers all morning, as a pattern that, once visible, could not be unseen. Ricci had positioned himself. He had the financial backing he'd stolen and stashed. He had Moretti's resources behind him. And in the morning, he was going to sit down with the people who'd been trying to eliminate Vincenzo De Luca for years and put something on the table that he'd been building toward for 16 years. "He's going to give them everything," she said. "Not just the accounts, not just the locations. He's going to give them you." "Yes." "How long until morning?" Marco checked. 9 hours. 9 hours. She looked at the table, at the power strip connected to nothing, at the lantern casting flat yellow light across the concrete floor. "I need a laptop and the strongest connection you can get me in this building," she said. "Felix's data, the full set. And I need someone who can make a call to the financial crimes unit at the Harbor City DA's office." She looked at Vincenzo. "Not because I want to involve them. Because Ricci's accounts are sitting in 2 cities, 2 states north, and nobody's touched them yet. And if they get frozen before morning, Ricci sits down with Moretti with nothing to put on the table." Vincenzo looked at her. "You want to cut his legs out?" "I want to cut his money out," she said, which is the same thing for a man who's been building this for 5 years. "The DA's office, I know what it costs you." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking you to walk in there. I'm asking you to find someone who owes you something useful. One call, one contact. The accounts flag, they freeze, they become evidence. And Ricci becomes a liability to Moretti instead of an asset." It was the longest thing she'd said in one stretch since she'd arrived in this building, and the cold was making her hand ache under the bandage, and she was running on the specific clarity that comes after the body gives up pretending it isn't exhausted. Vincenzo looked at the phone. He picked it up, set it back down, picked it up again. "This goes wrong," he said, "and we've handed them something they can use against us." "It's already wrong," she said. "I'm offering you a version of wrong that Ricci doesn't control." He dialed. The conversation was 4 minutes long. She listened to his side of it, measured, precise, the minimum information required and nothing else, and watched his face for what it didn't say. When he ended the call, he set the phone on the table and didn't look at it. 2 hours, he said. "For the flag or the freeze?" "The flag. The freeze takes longer." "How much longer?" "He didn't say." She nodded. 2 hours for the flag. Longer for the freeze. 9 hours until morning. The math was uncomfortable, but it was workable, which was the most she could ask for. Marco produced a laptop that he'd apparently been carrying in a bag she hadn't noticed. He connected it to a mobile hotspot from his phone and set it in front of her without ceremony. She opened it, started pulling the data she'd been working with all day from the accounts Felix had given her. She worked. Vincenzo sat across from her and made 2 more calls, brief, names she didn't recognize, and then he put the phone away and sat with his hands on the table and watched her work, which she registered and then stopped registering because she needed the focus. An hour in, Marco brought water and something wrapped in a napkin that turned out to be part of a sandwich. She ate it without stopping what she was doing. Her burned hand was developing a specific complaint about the angle she was holding it, and she adjusted and the complaint moved somewhere else, and she ignored it. At the 90-minute mark, her phone buzzed. Felix, second account flagged, working on first. She showed the screen to Vincenzo without a word. His expression didn't change, but he exhaled through his nose, barely audible, the kind of exhale that represents the releasing of something that had been held too long. 40 minutes after that, everything changed. The sound came from below. Not loud, not the explosive entry of the restaurant, not the force of the dry cleaner door. Just footsteps on the ground floor concrete, moving with the specific care of people who believe they are being quiet and are mostly succeeding. Marco was at the staircase before she registered that he'd moved. He had something in his hand. She looked away from it. Vincenzo was on his feet. He looked at the staircase. He looked at her. "How many ways in?" she said quietly. "Loading dock," Marco said, the same volume. "And the north face. There's a window on the ground floor that was resealed but not properly." "They came in different ways," Vincenzo said. It wasn't a question. Marco was already on his phone, 2 words, and one of the men from the second car appeared at the top of the staircase from a direction she hadn't tracked, which meant there was a second access point to the second floor she hadn't identified, which meant the building was less controlled than it had felt 40 minutes ago when they'd all arrived. The footsteps below stopped. That was worse than if they'd continued. She looked at the laptop. Felix's second message had come through while the footsteps were happening, and she'd missed it. She looked at it now. First account freeze confirmed. Both accounts locked. Ricci can't touch them. She showed Vincenzo. He read it. Something crossed his face. Not relief, not yet, but the specific quality of a man who has just watched one of the walls holding against him come down. Then the shooting started below. Not targeted at them? Not yet. She understood from the sound and the direction that it was Vincenzo's people and whoever had come through the ground floor, meeting in the dark in a building full of concrete and nowhere to go softly. Heavy, fast. 2 exchanges and then a third that was longer and more ragged. Then a voice from below carrying up the staircase. A voice she recognized from a single brief meeting in a room above a dry cleaner. "Vincenzo." Ricci's voice, warm even now. Warm in the specific way that had nothing underneath it. "I know you're up there. I know who's with you. I know how many." Silence. "I'm not here to finish this tonight," Ricci called. His voice moved. He was circling the base of the staircase, not coming up, staying in the dark below. "I'm here to offer you something that expires in about 4 minutes." Vincenzo looked at Marco. Marco shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Walk away," Ricci said. "Just you. Leave the girl and walk. I have no argument with you personally, Vincenzo. I never did. This was business. You know that." She looked at Vincenzo. His face was stone. "You have 4 minutes to decide," Ricci said. Vincenzo looked at her. Not the evaluative look, not the careful look. Something older than both of those. something that had been sitting behind all of it since the restaurant, since the offered hand she hadn't taken, since the coffee she hadn't drunk. She looked back at him steadily. "He doesn't know," "No," she said quietly, barely above breath. "Know what?" "About the accounts." She held his eyes. "He doesn't know they're frozen. He still thinks he has the money. He still thinks he has something to put on Moretti's table tomorrow." She paused. "Which means right now, in this building, in the dark, he needs you to walk out of here alive so that Moretti doesn't think he eliminated you himself. Because if you die here tonight, Moretti doesn't need Ricci anymore." Vincenzo's eyes sharpened. "He came here to move you," she said, "not to kill you. He needs you running, not dead. He needs to deliver you to Moretti as a controlled outcome." The warmth in Ricci's voice below had been exactly what it always was, a tool. But for the first time since she'd sat across from him in that room above the dry cleaner with his second cup of coffee near her hand, she understood the specific shape of the lie inside it. 3 minutes, Ricci called. Vincenzo looked at the staircase. Then he looked at her. And in his eyes, for the first time since she'd known him, she saw something that wasn't control, wasn't exhaustion, wasn't the long wait of a man who had been running an empire from inside a fortress built from other people's fear. She saw him calculating something that had a different variable at its center than the ones he'd been working with for the last 16 years. "Get behind the table," he said quietly. She moved. Marco moved. Vincenzo picked up his phone. He didn't call anyone. He typed something, sent it, pocketed the phone, looked at the staircase with the expression of a man who has just committed to a thing and is standing in the last second before its consequences begin. 2 minutes, Ricci called from below, and the warmth in his voice had thinned slightly, the way a surface thins when the weight on it exceeds its design. Vincenzo reached into his jacket and took out the pistol she'd seen holstered there twice without looking directly at it. He checked it with the specific economy of someone for whom the motion is completely without performance. He looked at Marco. Marco nodded. "Tell me something," Vincenzo said, his voice just above silence, looking at the staircase. "What?" she said. "The pattern you found in the numbers. The one in the first 40 seconds. He didn't look at her. "Did you already know it would be there, before you looked?" She thought about it honestly. "No, I just looked." "Why?" "Because nobody else was." He nodded once, slowly, like that answer had settled something he'd been holding open. Below, Ricci's voice came up the staircase again, and this time the warmth was entirely gone, and what replaced it was the thing that had always been underneath it, which was nothing at all. "Time's up, Vincenzo." The footsteps on the staircase began. Not careful anymore. Not trying to be quiet. The footsteps of people who have passed the point of strategy and arrived at the point of force, and the sound of them coming up through the dark of the Altieri building filled the cold second-floor air like something that had been approaching for a very long time and had finally stopped pretending it wasn't. Vincenzo moved to the left side of the staircase opening. Marco moved to the right. She pressed herself behind the table with Felix's data still glowing on the laptop screen and her burned hand flat against the concrete floor, and her heart doing something she had no useful description for. Not pounding, exactly, but present in a way she'd never been aware of it before, like her body was making sure she could feel it while she still could. The first figure came through the staircase opening, and the room became something entirely other than what it had been. The first man through the staircase opening caught Marco's elbow across the throat before he cleared the top step and went down hard, and the second came through immediately after the way they'd been trained to. No gap, no hesitation, assuming the first one would handle whatever was there and moving past him before confirming it. Vincenzo caught the second man at the top of the frame, and the struggle was brief and ugly and had nothing cinematic about it. It was two men in the dark fighting with the specific desperation of people who understand that the floor is the last place they want to be. Lena stayed behind the table. Not because she was paralyzed, because she was the only person in the room without a weapon, and getting in the middle of it would complicate things for the people who had them. And she understood this with the same clarity she'd been applying to numbers all day, the cold logic of what helps and what doesn't. A third man came through. She saw his outline before Vincenzo did. She threw the laptop, not aimed at his head. She wasn't built for that kind of precision and knew it. She threw it at his chest, which was larger, and it hit him at sternum height, and the surprise of it, The sheer unexpectedness of a laptop being thrown at you in a dark building made him step back into the frame of the staircase opening, and that half second was enough for Marco, who was back on his feet with blood on his jaw, to finish the conversation. Then it was quiet again. The kind of quiet that follows violence rather than precedes it. Thick, slightly disbelieving, full of the sound of people breathing through effort. Vincenzo was bleeding from somewhere above his left ear. He touched it, looked at his fingers, dismissed it with the expression of a man doing rapid damage assessment on himself and moving on. "Ricci," Marco said. It wasn't a question. He was looking at the staircase. "He didn't come up," Vincenzo said. "No." The footsteps below had stopped entirely. She listened and heard nothing, and the nothing was worse than the footsteps had been. "He sent 3 men and stayed down," she said. Both of them looked at her. "He sent them to move you," she said. "You didn't move, which means he's recalculating." She looked at the staircase. "Or he's already gone." Vincenzo looked at Marco. Marco crossed to the staircase and went down fast and quiet, and she sat in the dark with the lantern still burning on the floor and counted the seconds. 38. Then Marco's voice came up from below, one word, clear. Vincenzo went down. She followed. The ground floor was empty. The loading dock door was open. Not the way they'd left it, the padlock cut clean through and the door ajar, the cold air from outside moving through the space like a presence. One of their men was on the floor near the north window with a cut across his forehead that was bleeding significantly, but whose breathing was regular. The second man from the car was absent. "Santos," Vincenzo said. Marco shook his head. "Not dead. Gone." His phone was on the concrete floor near the north window, screen cracked, which meant he hadn't left voluntarily. Which meant Ricci had come in through the north window himself, taken Santos, and gone back out the same way, and the 3 men he'd sent up the stairs had been the distraction. The specific elegance of it sat in the room like something with teeth. "He has Santos," Marco said. "I know." Santos knows the Belmore location, the Hargrove accounts, I know what Santos knows, Vincenzo said. His voice had gone very flat. "Call the Belmore and get everyone out. Now." Marco was on the phone before he finished the sentence. Vincenzo stood in the middle of the ground floor with blood tracking down the left side of his face and his hands at his sides, and she watched him absorb it. The sequential losses, each one feeding the next. Ricci having built this architecture over years with the patience of someone who understood that you don't collapse a structure by hitting it once. You pull the supports one at a time until it comes down on its own weight. "The accounts," she said. "Ricci still doesn't know they're frozen." "He will soon," Vincenzo said, "when he tries to access them." "How soon?" "Hours. Maybe less." "Then that's the window." She looked at him. "When he finds out the money's gone, his value to Moretti collapses. He has nothing to sell them. Santos gives him locations and personnel, but that's operational. Moretti doesn't need Ricci for operational intelligence. They have their own. What Ricci offered them was a clean financial transition. Someone who understood the organization's money structure deeply enough to hand it over intact. She stopped. Without the money, he's a liability. A man who stole from one organization and got caught. Moretti doesn't take on other people's exposure. Vincenzo was looking at her. "He has one move left," she said, "and it's not Moretti anymore." "Then what is it?" She thought about it. About the man who had built 16 years of trust into a tool he'd been sharpening for 5. About the warmth in his voice that was a practice performance running over something completely cold. About the way he'd set that coffee cup down near her hand like a courtesy. Like a man who had already decided what came next and could afford the gesture. "You," she said. "He needs to eliminate you directly. Not through Moretti. If you're dead before morning, the organization destabilizes regardless of the money. And in the chaos, a frozen account can still be legally contested by a man with the right documentation and the right lawyer and enough time." Vincenzo was very still. "He needs tonight," she said. Marco came back from his call. "Belmore is clear, 2 hours ahead of schedule." He looked at the blood on Vincenzo's face. "How bad?" "Surface." Vincenzo touched it again. "Get the car. Different route." "Where are we going?" Vincenzo looked at Lena for a moment. Something in the look asked a question without forming one. He'll go somewhere he knows, she said, somewhere that was his before it was yours, somewhere you gave him access to, and he made his own. The processing center on Aldine, Vincenzo said. It wasn't directed at her. He set it to the space in front of him, the way you say a thing when you've just understood it, and the understanding isn't comfortable. He set up the security system there himself 7 years ago. He knows every inch of that building. Then that's where he's going with Santos, she said. Or that's where he wants me to think he's going. Yes, she said. Both things can be true. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, Marco, Aldine. They went out through the loading dock. The night air hit her like a correction. Cold, immediate, real in a way the inside of the building hadn't been. The car was where they'd left it, untouched. She got in the back. Vincenzo got in beside her. Marco drove. The processing center on Aldine Street was a legitimate business, commercial linen processing, the same company that fed into the financial network she'd been untangling since yesterday. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, a low industrial building with loading bays and a parking area and security lighting that did its job without calling attention to itself. Inside, according to Felix's structural notes she'd read that afternoon, it ran on 2 floors, the upper of which had been converted 4 years ago into what the official records listed as administrative space. What Sal Ricci had built up there over 7 years, apparently, was something more specific than that. They parked 2 blocks north and went the rest of the way on foot. Marco and the other surviving man from the car, a quiet presence named Drez, who she'd been aware of peripherally since the penthouse, moved ahead and she walked with Vincenzo, which was not how it had been arranged, but was how it happened. The man from the restaurant, Vincenzo said as they walked, not looking at her. The night all of this started. Bran Kovac, she said. You told me his name. He'd been trying to get to me for 3 months, Vincenzo said. 4 attempts, every one of them failed on information. Someone told us each time, early enough to adjust. He paused. I thought it was good intelligence work. My people staying sharp. Another pause. It was Ricci. He told us about every attempt because he needed Kovac to fail. He needed me to trust the intelligence system. He needed me to trust him. She walked beside him and let that sit. He was going to let Kovac succeed eventually, Vincenzo said, on a timeline he controlled, when the accounts were full enough, when the exit was ready. The restaurant wasn't supposed to happen, she said. No, Kovac got impatient, went off plan. He looked at the street ahead. And you? He stopped. Spilled boiling water, she said. Disrupted a 16-year project, he said, in 3 seconds, with a service cart. She almost laughed. It came out wrong, same as before, and she pressed it back down. Marco was at the corner ahead, signaling. They slowed. The processing center's loading bay on the east side showed a light that shouldn't have been on at this hour. Ground floor, interior. Not the security lighting, something inside, moving, the kind of inconsistent illumination that comes from a handheld source. Someone was in there. They went in through the south service entrance, which Marco opened with a key Vincenzo produced from inside his jacket. Not a building key, a small override key for the security panel beside the door. The kind of thing that exists specifically for situations where you need access without announcement. The ground floor was operational and dark. The machines that processed the linens, enormous, industrial, the kind of equipment that has its own smell and its own ambient warmth even when not running, stood in rows through the space like the bones of something large. They moved between them without sound. The light source was above them. The staircase to the upper floor was at the north end of the building. They reached it and stopped. Marco looked at Vincenzo. Vincenzo looked at the staircase. Then from above, a voice. Santos. Strained and controlled, reading something aloud, which meant someone was making him do it, which meant Ricci was extracting what Santos knew in whatever form Santos could provide it. Vincenzo moved up the staircase first. She stayed close. Not because anyone had told her to, but because staying separate in a building she didn't know seemed like the worst option. And because the distance between herself and the only person whose intentions she'd verified tonight felt like a thing she wanted to keep manageable. The upper floor was what the records had called administrative space, and someone had made it function as that while also making it function as something else. Desks and filing systems on one side. On the other side, visible through an interior window that ran the length of the room, a space that had been stripped of its original purpose and furnished sparsely. A table, chairs, a shelf of communications equipment that was newer than the building it sat in. The light source was in there. A work lamp on the table, directional, pointed at Santos, who sat in one of the chairs with his wrists secured behind him with the kind of zip ties that are not for office use. Richie stood behind Santos with a phone in one hand, recording or documenting whatever Santos was saying, and he was so focused on the extraction that he didn't hear them come up the stairs. He heard them when Vincenzo pushed through the door. What happened in the next 4 seconds was not a scene from a film. It was too fast and too badly lit and too graceless for that. Richie moved the moment the door moved, not toward Santos, away from him, which was the response of a man who had already accepted what Santos was worth versus what his own survival was worth. He had something in his right hand that wasn't the phone anymore, and he brought it up, and Vincenzo moved left, and the shot that came out of it hit the wall behind where Vincenzo's head had been and left a sound in the room that compressed the air and left everyone's ears ringing. Marco came through the door. Dres came through a second door she hadn't known existed. Richie read all of it in under a second and made the calculation that people in his position make when the numbers stop adding up in their favor. He lowered his arm. "Sal," Vincenzo said. His voice was the quietest she'd heard it. Richie looked at him. The warmth was entirely absent now. She'd noticed it thin in the Altieri building, but here it was simply gone, like a coat finally taken off, and what was underneath it was a face that was older than it had appeared and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "You knew," Richie said, not accusatory, almost curious. "Not until yesterday," Vincenzo said. "The girl. The numbers." Richie looked at her. His expression didn't change much. "You found it in 3 hours." "The pattern wasn't hidden well enough," she said. "It was hidden well enough for someone who was looking for a person, not for someone looking at the math." He looked at her for a moment longer, then back at Vincenzo. "The accounts," he said. "Frozen," Vincenzo said. Something moved through Richie's face. Not surprise. He'd had time to attempt access and find them locked. Just the final confirmation of a thing already known. The last variable resolved in a direction he hadn't built for. 16 years, Vincenzo said. "Yes." "And you were going to walk?" "Yes." No hesitation, no apology in it. Just the word, plain. The way you deliver a fact to someone who already has it and is asking only to hear you say it. "Why?" Vincenzo said. Richie looked at him for a moment. "Because I'd been doing your job for you for 16 years, and you were going to do it for another 16, and I was going to be exactly where I am right now, standing behind you." He said it without heat. That was the worst part of it. Not beside you, behind you. I built the security infrastructure that kept you alive 4 separate times in the last 3 years. I built the intelligence network that caught 3 of Moretti's attempts before they reached you. I kept this organization functional through 2 crises that would have ended it without me. He paused. And I was Sal, who handles things. In the back. The room held that. Vincenzo said nothing for a long time. "You should have talked to me," he finally said. "Would it have changed anything?" Another long silence. And she watched Vincenzo's face during it. The specific cost of an honest answer to that question. The weight of everything the past 16 years actually were, rather than what either of them would have preferred them to be. "I don't know," Vincenzo said. It was the second most honest thing she'd heard him say. Richie looked at him. Something in his face shifted, not toward warmth, but toward something that had lived beneath the warmth, something genuine that the performance had been built over. "I know," he said quietly. "That's the answer." Marco moved. It was over quickly and without ceremony, and she turned away from it not out of weakness, but out of the specific understanding that some things are not meant to be witnessed by people who don't have to be there. She looked at Santos, who was still in the chair with his wrists secured and his face carrying the expression of a man who has been in a very bad situation for a few hours and is only now beginning to believe it might be ending. She crossed the room and found the edge of the zip ties and looked around for something to cut them with. Found a utility blade on the shelf of communications equipment. Cut them. Santos pulled his wrists forward and held them for a moment with his eyes closed. "You okay?" she asked. He looked at her. Mostly. His voice was rough. He wanted the Hargrove routing numbers. I gave him wrong ones. He said it with a particular flatness that she understood was its own form of dignity. Smart, she said. Slow, he said. Took me too long to think of it. She set the utility blade back on the shelf. She looked around the room, the work lamp on the table, the communications equipment, the filing systems on the other side of the interior window. All of it built by a man who'd been indispensable for 16 years and had decided that indispensable wasn't enough. She didn't let herself look at what Marco was doing. Vincenzo came to stand beside her. He wasn't bleeding from the head wound anymore. It had dried. He looked at Santos and said something quiet that she didn't catch. And Santos nodded and stood, and Marco was there to help him to the door. And then it was just her and Vincenzo in the stripped room, with the work lamp casting its narrow column of light. The Moretti meeting, she said. Tomorrow morning. Won't happen, he said. Without Ricci and without the financial offer, there's nothing to meet about. They're not going to make a move on me without a transition plan in place. They're businessmen, not soldiers. They understand what chaos costs. He looked at the communications equipment. And by morning, they'll know the accounts are frozen and that there's a paper trail leading out of their direction if anyone decides to look. He paused. Nobody's going to look if nobody pushes them to. She understood the implication. You're giving them an exit. I'm giving the situation an exit, he said, which is the same thing. She thought about Felix, who was somewhere safe with his laptop and his precise handwriting, and his 16 months of knowing something was wrong and being careful about it in all the wrong directions. She thought about Santos with his wrong routing numbers. She thought about Marco, who had been in every room and heard everything and communicated primarily through the quality of his attention. She thought about a tailor shop with a muted television and a folded curtain and the specific smell of steam and wool. What happens now? She asked. Vincenzo looked at her. What do you want to happen? It was such a direct question that she didn't have an immediate answer, which surprised her. She'd spent the last 4 days answering questions reflexively, operating on the reduced logic of someone with no good options and a diminishing window. The idea of being asked what she actually wanted felt like a different language. I want my hand to stop hurting, she said. He almost smiled. She saw the structure of it in his face without it completing itself. That one I can help with. I want to know if Felix is actually all right. He is. I'll have Marco confirm it for you. And I want... She stopped, looked at the work lamp. I want to finish what I started with the ledgers. Not for any reason that benefits you specifically. I want to know where the money actually went, all of it, because I looked at the numbers and the numbers deserve to be followed to the end. He looked at her for a long moment. That's an unusual reason, he said. That's the only reason I have. All right, he said. They left the Aldine Street building before the sky began to lighten, and she didn't look back at it, and she didn't ask questions about the practical arrangements that Marco and Dres handled in the hour that followed. She sat in the car and held her burned hand in her lap and watched the city come apart into its pre-dawn pieces. The delivery trucks again, the early walkers, the specific amber of streetlights against a sky that hadn't decided yet what color it intended to be. 3 weeks passed. She moved out of the room above the dry cleaner into a different space on the same network, a converted office above a parking structure on the north side that had a window facing the right direction and water pressure that made its own decisions but generally arrived when needed. She paid for it from the money that was still folded inside the lining of a coat she'd retrieved eventually from her old apartment, which she did not return to live in and which had been relet by her landlord within 10 days, which told her something about both the landlord and the durability of her former life that she tried not to examine too closely. She worked with Felix on the ledgers every day for the first week. He brought coffee, and she didn't always drink it, and they didn't talk much except about the numbers, which suited both of them. She traced Ricci's accounts to their endpoint, not just the 2 she'd found initially, but a network of 9 that he'd been building and feeding over 5 years, each one buffered by a layer of documentation he'd assembled with the same organizational precision he'd applied to everything else. The total she arrived at, when she finally had the full picture, was just over $1.1 million. She sat with that number for a long time. Felix sat beside her and was quiet. He was patient, she said finally. Yes, Felix said. He could have taken twice this if he'd kept going. Yes. She looked at the number on the screen. He got impatient. People do, Felix said. He said it without judgment, which was the kind of thing she was learning was typical of him. His specific gift was receiving information without editorializing it. She submitted the full trace to Vincenzo in a single document with a cover page that said, Final Account, S. Ricci, and contained everything she'd found, organized by date and entity and amount, with the 9 account details and the full paper trail she'd reconstructed. She gave it to Marco to deliver because she wasn't ready to deliver it herself, and she thought Vincenzo would understand that without her having to explain it. He did. He sent back one line through Marco. Accurate to the last detail. Thank you. Not to the last dollar. To the last detail. She noticed the distinction. In the second week, she started working with Felix on a different problem. The financial structure of the legitimate businesses, specifically the gaps and vulnerabilities that had allowed Ricci's skimming to run undetected for over a year. It was not interesting work in the way the investigation had been. It was careful, methodical, the financial equivalent of repointing the brickwork on a structure that had been sound except in the one place where it wasn't. She did it because Felix needed someone who could see the gaps and she could see them, and because having something specific and solvable to do was the only reliable antidote she'd found for the particular quality of exhaustion that followed several days of being in genuine physical danger. Her hand healed. Not perfectly. The skin at the center of the burn would always have a different texture than the skin around it, tighter, slightly altered in the way that damaged things alter. She stopped wearing the bandage at the end of the second week and didn't particularly miss it. The Moretti syndicate did not make a move. The meeting that had been scheduled for the morning after the Altieri building did not happen. Carver, the operations manager whose name she'd never seen but whose function she understood from the financial traces, went quiet in a way that suggested strategic retreat rather than preparation. Harbor City did what it had been doing for decades, absorbed its own violence and kept moving. She was in the North Side office on a Tuesday morning in the fourth week, working through the linen company's vendor contracts, when she became aware that someone had come in behind her without knocking. She turned. Vincenzo stood in the doorway. He looked better than he had in the tailor shop, better than he had in the Altieri building or the penthouse or the car. Not rested exactly. She wasn't sure he was a man capable of looking rested, but less compressed. Like something that had been bearing weight at an unsustainable angle had been redistributed. He had 2 coffees. He set one near her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up. Felix says you found 17 vulnerabilities in the vendor contract structure, he said. 18, she said. I found another one this morning. He sat down in the chair across from her. He looked at the screen over her shoulder for a moment. What do you want to do next? He said. She looked at him. After the vendor contracts? After all of it. He looked at her directly. I'm restructuring 3 of the legitimate entities, removing the secondary book structure entirely from 2 of them. He paused. It changes what they are. Makes them actually legitimate, she said. More so, he said. Not entirely, but more so. She looked at the coffee in her hand. Why are you telling me this? Because the person I need to run the financial oversight of those entities should probably know what they're being asked to oversee. She was quiet for a moment. That's not a small thing you're asking, she said. No. I'm not an accountant. I have 1 semester of bookkeeping and I dropped it. I know. What you know, she said, is that I can read numbers. That's different. Yes, he said. It is. I know which one I need. She looked at the screen, at the vendor contracts, at the column of figures she'd been running for the past hour with the specific focus that she'd apparently always had and had only recently found a use for. She thought about the apartment with the stuck lock, the overdue bills, the 9 months of soup trays and blistered heels, and the permanent low-level ache of surviving something that wasn't meant to be survived permanently. She thought about the specific smallness of a life built out of endurance rather than intention. She thought about a service cart and a tray of tomato basil soup and 3 seconds that had changed the direction of everything. I have conditions, she said. You always do, he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard in it before, something that had room in it. Felix reports to me on the vendor side, not the other way around. Done. I want access to all 3 entities, complete, not filtered. Done. And I want to know, going forward, When something is about to happen that affects the work I'm doing, not after, before. He looked at her for a moment. I'll try. That's not the same as yes. No, he said. It isn't. But it's honest. She looked at him. At the lines around his eyes that were the same as they'd been the first night she'd seen them across a restaurant. The tiredness that wasn't going anywhere. The weight that had been carried so long it had become structural. She'd thought of it as burden then. She was starting to understand it differently. All right, she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside the north side window. The city was going about its business. A bus making its stop. Two people arguing at a crosswalk. A pigeon doing whatever pigeons do on a Tuesday morning in a city that had no particular opinion about any of it. It was 2 months after all of it when they went back to Caruso's. Not planned. Or rather, she hadn't planned it. She'd been walking past on a different errand, the dry cleaner 2 blocks up, a practical trip that had nothing to do with the building she used to use or the people she used to know there. And she'd stopped on the sidewalk outside and looked at the door and stood there long enough that a passing woman gave her the sideways look, reserved for people who stand in the middle of sidewalks without apparent purpose. She went in. It had been repaired. The marble counter was the same marble, she was almost certain. There was a different quality to the seam near the east end that suggested professional repair rather than replacement, which was either Caruso's attachment to original materials or insurance parsimony. The tables were the same. The soft jazz from the speakers was the same. The smell of coffee and olive oil was the same. The maitre d' showed her to a table without recognizing her. She ordered the tomato basil soup. She was most of the way through it when the door opened and Vincenzo came in, and she understood from the fact that he didn't look surprised to see her that Marco had called ahead, because Marco always knew where she was and always would, which was something she'd made her peace with gradually and incompletely. He sat down across from her, looked at the soup. Good? He said. Same as it was, she said, which is the point. He ordered coffee. The waiter brought it without fanfare and left them alone in the way that good waitstaff do, present when needed, absent otherwise. She looked at the repaired seam on the marble counter. I've been thinking about the man 4 years ago, she said, the one Ricci investigated. Vincenzo looked at his coffee. Marcus Vale. Was he guilty? A pause, long enough that she could read the weight of it. I don't know, he said. I thought so at the time. Now I think the answer is that I can't know. He looked up. And that's a harder thing to sit with than if the answer were simply no. She nodded. Is that something you can continue with? He asked. Knowing that there are things in the history of this organization that I can't clean up and can't correct. She looked at her soup, at the burn scar on her hand, visible now, without the bandage, sitting in the light from the window. At the table that was the same table where she'd stood 3 seconds before her life changed. I'm not here to clean it up, she said. I'm here to watch what happens next. She looked at him. Those are different jobs. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face was doing the quiet version of what it had done in the Altieri building in the last second before things fell apart. A man arriving at a fact about himself that he hadn't had the language for before now. Yes, he said, they are. The jazz from the speakers moved through the restaurant the way it always had. Low, continuous, not demanding anything. The rain that had started during the walkover tapped against the windows in the irregular rhythm of rain that isn't committing to anything. The coffee in his cup sent up a thin column of steam that bent slightly in some draft from somewhere and dissipated. He reached into his jacket and placed something on the table. A pair of gloves. Leather, dark, the kind with careful stitching at the knuckles. Not expensive in a showy way. Expensive in the way that things are expensive when they're made to last. For the hand, he said. The cold does something to that kind of scar. She picked one up, turned it over. The stitching was precise. I'm not wearing gloves inside a restaurant, she said. No, he said. But you walk 14 blocks to the north office every morning. She set it back down, looked at it for a moment, picked up her spoon. Thank you, she said. They finished their meal without resolving anything that didn't need to be resolved. They sat in the same restaurant where a service card had tipped and a life had cracked open, and they ordered what they wanted and ate it while the rain continued outside, and Harbor City moved through its Tuesday evening without particular interest in either of them. She put the gloves in her jacket pocket when they left. Outside, the street was wet and orange under the lights, and the traffic had thinned to the intermittent kind. A cab, a delivery bike, a couple under one umbrella walking close. She stood on the sidewalk and felt the cold on her scarred hand and the specific weight of the gloves in her pocket, and the even more specific weight of everything the last 2 months had been. She'd spent 9 months surviving a life she'd built out of necessity. She was building something now out of choice, which was not the same thing, and not necessarily better, and not without its own costs, some of which she could see, and some of which she suspected were still approaching. But the choosing was hers. Vincenzo stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to make the moment into something it wasn't. They walked. Harbor City moved around them in all directions, enormous, indifferent, full of its own machinery, grinding through its own. Tuesday, 10,000 separate lives running in parallel to theirs without intersection or awareness. Above them, the clouds had broken slightly in the east, and somewhere past the overpass and the crane and the top floor of a building whose name neither of them knew, a strip of sky had gone a dark and specific blue that was not quite night anymore and was not yet anything else. Lena Mercer put her hands in her pockets and walked through it. The burn scar caught the cold of the night air. She let it.